In America, I began to discover that every person is unique, unrepeatable, and necessary, with the moral capacity of self-realization that dignity resides in the individual person, not in the group.
Welcome back to Prosper, everyone. I'm your host, Andreas Wittmer, joined as always by my colleague, Rebecca Teddy. Welcome, Rebecca. Today, we welcome to the show someone I really admire. His name is Ismael Hernandez, and he is the executive director of the Freedom and Virtue Institute, which he founded based on 15 years of experience in the inner city ministries.
Mr. Hernandez's writing has appeared widely in all kinds of venues, and he has two books, Not Tragically Colored, written with our late colleague Michael Novak. And just recently, he released Rethinking Charity, Restoring Dignity to Poverty Relief. And that's a topic which he's lived on both sides of the charity equation and on which he's passionate. And I think he's going to really challenge all of our thinking. So we're looking forward to that.
Yeah, I think so too. He's really somebody with an incredible personal story as well, which is something we will get him to tell. Welcome, Ismael. I think you and I met each other probably 10 years or more ago. Was it in Acton University? I am super happy to introduce you to our audience now. Welcome very much.
Well, thank you. It's always great to see you. It's great to see you, Rebecca, and I'm an honor to be with you today.
I think you and I were in the same sort of training group where we first attended Acton University as spectators or as students, let's say.
That's
right?
True.
And I think we met each other that way. And then eventually we both at the same time became speakers as well. And since then, I see you at least once a year, and that's at Acton, right?
That's correct. I think I remember that time. It's been quite a few years.
Now, if I, speaking of time and how time passes, if I would have met you before you went to university here in the US, and I would tell your young self that you would be a guest on a podcast defending the free market and virtue, would you have believed it? And I'd love to have you tell us a little bit about how you were raised and where, and that whole story by who the people are in your background. And there's just an incredible story of how you were raised and you came to believe what you believe today.
Absolutely. I wouldn't have believed you. I would have really been very upset with you because you would have been my enemy then. And I grew up in Puerto Rico, in the Puerto Rico of the 1960s, in a communist household. My father was one of the founders of the Socialist Party of Puerto Rico, a party heavily aligned with the Cuban Revolution and the thought of the great Marxist revolutionary Antonio Gramsci, the one who invented or created cultural Marxism. And it was a revolutionary party, very small. I grew up seeing my father go to Cuba, listening to the never-ending speeches by Fidel Castro when you are 6 years old, and your father forces you to listen to a 5-hour speech. You can imagine how that was.
That's funny.
Those speeches are legendary, and the idea of making a 6-year-old endure them is quite something.
Yes. But that was the environment, reading propaganda, listening to my father's daily harangues against Yankee imperialism and capitalism, and seeing him investing his life in the ideas of Marxist-Leninist ideology. And he was an intellectually sophisticated man, an activist, and he would say things like, I will give the lives of these 4 children we have at home for revolution to my mom, and I never forget how she would cry constantly because those things were hurtful. And at the same time, deep inside of me, I wanted what my father was offering. It was intoxicating. It was this idea that we had this radical capacity of changing the world with our activism, that one day we will conquer power and will bring about the great utopia to come. And for example, another example is seeing my mom in the middle of the night run out of the house to speak with 2 men who were always in front of our house, very conspicuously, always there, And I can still feel how I felt that day. How the fear I had in seeing her going out of the home and not knowing what was going to happen to her. Many years later, I found out that they were FBI agents following my father, and I hated them. I blamed them for the Puerto Rican poverty that surrounded us in the 1960s. In a society in transition from an agricultural and backward economy into a more industrialized one, and all the turmoil that causes, I blamed all in on the Yankee and the imperialists attacking our little island. And I blame them for
Mhm.
the bad marriage between
Was it?
mom and dad because she was in love with him and
Yeah.
he was in love with the revolution.
Was he a professor, or what was his work? Your dad?
He was an engineer. He worked for American companies like Eli Lilly, and other companies doing chemical work as a chemist and as an engineer in chemistry. But he could not keep many jobs because he every time he got a job, he tried to organize the workers for revolution, and here comes the FBI behind, and he will lose one job after the other. And he will not change his philosophy for anything, and that was a source of problems. For more than 3 years, I remember the only income that coming to the home was $25 a week that my older sister, who lived in the United States, will send to my mom. And that was all the income coming to the household. And at the same time, my mom was a humble Puerto Rican of the 1960s who will say, well, if your father says we're communists, okay, we're communists. She didn't really care about politics. She only cared about, how I'm going to feed these kids and you cannot keep a job
Yeah.
because of your activist philosophy. I have his extensive FBI file with me that denotes 30 years of communist activity, 2 court cases for terrorism, and a life dedicated to the cause of Marxism. I probably have
Mhm.
my own file somewhere in some FBI
I
file.
bet you do. I bet you do.
I never
So
wanted to find out.
you said something intriguing, even though you didn't like to see your mom cry. You
Yes.
were actually thrilled by your dad's talk of
Yes.
revolution, and you felt like, as a little kid, that you were part of something really big and important.
Yes.
And with that background, tell us about how you ended up in favor of the free market, because that
Oh,
doesn't sound like an auspicious beginning for that.
definitely no. Well, my mother would send my older brother and myself to mass with friends without my father knowing about it. And because religion was the opium of the people, and he did not believe in religious matters. Interestingly, he was the rosary prayer for the community. Why is that?
Huh.
Because Catholicism was a sign of our opposition to American Protestant imperialism. Not because he believed in it, but because it was a sign of our commitment to the revolution. But I developed a sort of double consciousness of Marx and Jesus, the revolution and the kingdom all merged together. And eventually I joined the party with my father anyway. But I had these inklings about God, and I went to study political science at the University of Puerto Rico, intent in destroying America. That was my goal. But I still wanted to merge this double consciousness of God and Marx. And I always say, well, what was a good Catholic and communist kid to do to merge that double consciousness? I joined the Jesuit order, of course. I, I decided
Are
to
we allowed
become
to
a
say
Jesuit.
that?
The reality is that in the mid 1980s, revolution was brewing in Central America, and the Jesuits were at the forefront of that liberation theology movement in all of Central America, and that was part of the Puerto Rican Jesuit group. We were part of the Central American province. And the reality is that Marxism was in the culture of the order there. And I said, this is my place. I can have my cake and eat it too, and they were going to be sending me to Sandinista Nicaragua, of all places. You can imagine what that meant to me. I was going to be studying at the feet of the Masters of Liberation Theology, Illacuría, Segundo, Gutierrez, and many others who were either professors at the university or lecturers at the university. However, it never happened. I did my first vows, and few weeks I was going to be heading to Nicaragua. 7 Jesuits were murdered in El Salvador, as you can probably remember, in 1987. And I was going to be living in the home where they were massacred. So, out of concern for us, they did not send us there. They wanted to send me to Fordham here in the United States, and that's when I left seminary. I was not interested in being a priest. I wanted to be a revolutionary priest in Nicaragua fighting America. That's different, you know. And I said to them, I'm not going to the guts of the monster, as we call America in the party. I left seminary frustrated, angrier than ever because my dreams have been not happen. But I decided eventually to come to the guts of the monster anyway. And that's, to answer your question, that's when I begin to have an encounter with a new understanding of what it means to be human. I always say that that's when my lungs were filled with the air of freedom when I came to the United States, at the University of Southern Mississippi, of all places.
So your dad was okay as long as you mixed Jesus and Marx together, and Marx was number one. And so he was fine with you going into the Jesuits. He didn't mind.
Absolutely, he did not mind. In fact, in a sense, he was a little jealous because he knew the Jesuits, and I'm not trying to blame the Jesuits. The reality is that in historical context, that's the reality in the order. And he knew I was going to Sandinista Nicaragua. You can only imagine what that meant to him. So he was proud, and he was a little jealous. He wished he could have done something similar. Because our Catholicism, again, was cultural Catholicism. It was an affirmation of the Puerto Rican identity.
Yeah, and then once Nicaragua didn't happen because of this, the horrible murder down there of these 7 priests, then they say, "Oh, go to Fordham," and you say, "No, I'm actually leaving seminary. I'm going to go somewhere else." How did you get into the Southern Mississippi University?
Well, I went back to Isabela, my little town in Isabela, Puerto Rico, and there one of my good friends told me I had been accepted to study law at the Pontifical University in Ponce, Puerto Rico, but I didn't have any money, so I couldn't go there. But my friend said, "Ismael, I went to this university in the south in the United States. It's very inexpensive. I have friends that can give you shelter. It will not be that difficult." So it really was a financial situation where I could make it work for me and my family at that time. My father was not really contributing much financially to our home. It was really in the hands of my mother. And that was the only way to advance my studies beyond my bachelor's degree. I finished my political science bachelor's degree in Puerto Rico, barely, because I was almost expelled a couple of times because of my revolutionary activities. I always had good grades, but I was doing more revolutionary than studying, That's
like father, like son.
Yeah, exactly. That's where I ended in southern Mississippi, of all places. So you can imagine this black Puerto Rican boy who hates America lands in Dixie. But it was really a change in my life.
When you went there, were you looking for like-minded people in terms of, revolution and Marxism or communism? And then who did you actually meet? How did that happen?
Really, I couldn't meet anyone there. I was somewhat isolated, really. I was barely speaking English. So I was trying to understand what I was being told. And there were no socialists in southern Mississippi, in Harrisburg, Mississippi. And I dedicated myself to study and to try to learn English. I was still thinking in Spanish. and translating in my mind into English. It was very difficult, but at the same I began to make friends, and I began to have a good time here in the Gods of the Monster. That wasn't supposed to be happening. But I began to realize that this was not exactly as my father has said it was. And began to have certain experiences here in America. For example, I had good grades, and one day they called me to the dean's office and offered me a full assistantship, paying me all my studies. And I said to myself, I hate your guts and you're rewarding me. This is not supposed to happen. And I began to compare my Puerto Rican life of poverty with what you Americans call poverty here in America. And I said, give me some of that poverty, please. Compare with the Puerto Rican poverty of the 1960s. Southern Mississippi was mighty nice. So I began to have questions about my allegiances, and I began to discover that connection between reward and accomplishment. I did something and something good happened to me. And I began to discover a new anthropology. The Marxist anthropology had me as a wave as a drop in the wave of the revolution. Within the revolution, within the wave, that drop had meaning and purpose. Outside of the wave, I was nothing but a curious accumulation of atoms destined to nothingness at death. So my purpose in life was identified with the revolution. In America, I began to discover that every person is unique, unrepeatable, and necessary, with the moral capacity of self-realization, that dignity resides in the individual person, not in the group. So that was a totally radical change in mindset that I began slowly to encounter here in America. And in the process, I lost my father.
Yeah, this is such a thrilling story. Thanks for sharing this. We're going to go back into it when we return and talk about some of the work you're doing right now. But first, we just want to take a quick word to hear from our sponsor.
Hi, I'm Father Bob Gall, Director of the Church Management Program at the Catholic University of America. Are you a Catholic layman, woman, priest, or religious running a beautiful school, parish, or apostolate, wrestling with finance and administrative issues you never imagined when you first answered God's call? Are you striving to build something beautiful for God and His people, but need training in personnel management, fundraising, and managing assets in accord with canon law? Well, the Church Management Program at the Catholic University of America's Business School offers a flexible program for you. Our self-paced online programs will help you and your team get the tools you need to see your mission advance, even beyond your wildest dreams. The Catholic University of America is now accepting applications for the master's degree in church management for those aiming to begin their studies in early 2025. One can also enroll in individual courses or pursue one of our graduate certificates. For more details, find us in the show notes for this episode of Prosper or visit our website, meam.catholic.edu. That's meam.catholic.edu.
Welcome back. If you're just joining us, we've been talking with Ismael Hernandez, the president and founder of the Freedom and Virtue Institute, about his childhood, being raised by a Communist Party leader in Puerto Rico, and the steps that eventually led him to come here to the United States and experience what he says poverty in the United States, which made him react and saying, give me more poverty of that than what I had back in Puerto Rico. Now, Ismael, I'd love to learn a little more that so you come to America, you go to Southern Mississippi State University, I think, and you're starting to see some of the benefits in a way, or the upsides of the free market, even as you are poor, literally poor being there. And you said you recognized human dignity for everybody. And how did that coincide with your faith? I mean, you were educated as a Jesuit seminarian, at least for a couple of years. And how did that converge with your starting to see the free market, in a sense, as not as bad as you thought you were going to see? And how did this jive and merge with your views of religion?
It was difficult because my Catholic faith was really associated and intrinsically connected to my Marxist ideology. I could not understand Christianity apart from being the praxis of socialism. Socialism was a substantial idea, and Christianity was the praxis in helping and loving the poor and trying to liberate the poor from the oppression of capitalism. And once my socialism was gone, a great personal cost because my father would not speak to me for the last 5 years of his life. I was basically dead to him because I had betrayed our identity. That's why I always say that, we were an authentic Marxist Leninist household. We were not like this American cafe latte sipping, iPhone texting American socialists, or going to the rally in the morning and shopping at the Gap in the afternoon. No, we were real Marxists. So nothing made sense anymore. At the same time, that gave me the opportunity of challenging the safe assumptions of my ideology and begin to discover my faith in a more orthodox fashion, to realize that my faith was true. What was wrong was the prism of understanding through which I filtered my faith. And so I began to read what I had never read before, both in the political realm, and because that was junky propaganda. We have the truth. We are not here to have a debate with the capitalists. We're here to destroy them. That's what my father used to say all the time. We already have our truth. But at the same time, I began to reread and relearn my Catholic faith. It was always there because I had received that gift from God before. I just didn't see it. It was all under the cloud of my ideology.
All of this is a process, right? I
Yes.
think many people, no matter what their path of conversion is,
Yes.
it takes 6, 8 years, takes a lifetime of a journey. But sometimes there's a particular moment where you turn the page. And was there a moment where Christ became more real and a person to you, or something like that, that you could say, I started to really definitively think differently?
I would say that in the political realm, beginning to read Friedrich Hayek, even though Mises himself was not a believer, he gave me an understanding of economics that I had never encountered before. Reading Thomas Sowell, who became really a man who challenged my ideas about race and culture, race and economics. But in the Catholic realm, I would not give you a specific book. I would say that the papacy of John Paul II, him, began to challenge my life as I had never experienced before. Reading, I would say, Veritatis Splendor became a favorite encyclical of mine. It's about morality, it may not be about politics, but it gave me a different understanding of reality itself, of what is right and wrong,
Yeah.
that I had never had before. And Centesimus Annus, I will say, that also challenged my ideas, because in Centesimus Annus, John Paul II challenges the welfare state. And the welfare state for me was untouchable. It was, we needed to have it. And I began to radically change my mind on that. I discovered in the Acton Institute also. I remember one day listening to Father Sirico, watching him on EWTN, and at that point, I thought that I was a heretic because I no longer was a socialist. And here is this priest speaking a language. So, okay, that's what I believe. And I never forget, I went
You
to
were a
the
socialist
website.
heretic. I love it.
Exactly, I was a socialist heretic and a Catholic heretic at the same time. But I went to the website and found the Acton Institute and signed for one of their conferences toward the Free and Virtuous Society, which now I continue to speak on in that conferences. And that was the first conference I attended. And I began to discover this world I didn't know existed.
What I find is interesting, Ismael, is that you didn't really, you came to the US and you had no means, you had no money, you were
No.
poor. And at
Yes.
that point, you were still poor because I understand you met your wife at the university and the two of
Yes.
you met and fell in love and then you started your family in Florida. Is that right?
Well, we had our first child who died while we were still students,
Oh, I'm sorry.
graduate students at the university. But our first child was born in Florida. In the beginning, my wife says I was scared of you because I thought you were some kind of spy because my political ideas were very radical still. And it took about 4 or 5 years for that to change while I was in here. At the same time, certain historical things happened. The wall fell, and that wasn't supposed to happen. I had good grades, and they gave me an assistantship. That wasn't supposed to happen. I was having a good time in America. That wasn't supposed to happen. So it was really an experience first and an intellectual
Yeah.
quest later, in that order. And we have
Yeah.
applied that in the Freedom and Virtue Institute since.
Ismael, if I may, I'm going to jump ahead in your story a little bit.
Yes.
Simply because as we've talked about, you've been on both sides of the poverty question. And last
Yes.
summer, actually, again at Acton University, which was the great connector, because that's where you and I also met, I heard
Yes.
you tell a really moving story about observing a charity line at a church. I don't recall exactly, but some kind of giveaway for poor kids. And I remember you saying that you just watched those kids in line and you thought, they are taking away the wrong message from this program, even though the program is very, very well intended and probably really good-hearted, generous people behind it. Tell us a little bit
Yes.
about that and how that experience got you doing your present work.
Well, I was about 10 years ago attending a school supplies distribution event. They happen all over America, as you know. The summer comes,
Yeah.
and well-intended people want to help the kids. And they had these events and I attended one where I saw a massive number of kids, most of them, a sea of black and brown kids, getting the free cheap school supplies from a small cadre of white people. And I asked myself, number one, why is always us in the receiving end? Why is always us in the minority community in the receiving end? I want to be in the giving end. It feels better. It's more uplifting. It's more consistent with my dignity. It doesn't have to be this way. It doesn't have to be us always here in this paternalistic, condescending exercise, well intended, but really dimming the light of dignity. And the second question I asked myself was, what were the kids learning from this exercise? Where they were learning that there is benefit at the end of the long lines of dependency, and that this is the normal way of meeting human needs. I stand in line and strangers meet my needs. And those strangers who look pale, and my community tells me that they are the enemy. But they have the good stuff. So I can smile at them, I get the stuff, and I go back, and I never discover my dignity as a unique, unrepeatable person made in the image and likeness of God with the moral capacity of self-realization. That because I'm made in the image and likeness of God, I have a capacity of reason and the capacity of making choices for myself. And that I can discover the truth and do the
That,
good, and I can recreate the
yeah.
environment and create wealth. And we never discovered this reality.
I've been following what you're doing with the Freedom and Virtue Institute for a long time, and we've had through foundations and stuff. I've seen what you're doing, but specifically,
Yes.
you gave me the privilege to pre-read
Yes.
your latest book. And I find you put the finger on where the issue is, which is it actually starts with this story that you're telling and the message that our poverty alleviation efforts, the message that they send, and that often our helping hurts or the way we help hurts.
Yes.
and you change people's minds in what needs to happen in these efforts. Can you talk a little bit on maybe on a high level of how should we? The book is called Rethinking Charity. How should we rethink charity, and what will people learn when they read your book?
Well, I believe that they will learn that there is a deeper reality about the human person that is untouched many times by our charity efforts. So we need to go to the foundations of what does it mean to be a human being. We need to start with the human person and what does it mean to be human. And what are we then asked to do in the face of the reality of the human person? And charity, unfortunately, has become what I call a conceit. It's a hyperbolic effort to try to get to the packets of people, to make them feel bad about the situation of others, and try to fix the situation by creating these hyperbolic images about poverty. So the poor become an image, a moment, a part of a propaganda campaign that we put together so people can send us money. But when we understand the human person in all the reality of what it doesn't mean to be human, and we understand also the ideologies that are behind much of what we do. For example, the blaming the victim narrative. I challenge people towards personal responsibility. I blame them as victims of forces outside of their control. So we are objectivizing the poor. We are making them objects moved by forces, and they don't have control over their lives. They don't have agency. They are not subjects of meaning and purpose, but
Mhm.
objects of our magnanimity. They are the
Mhm.
scenery in the drama of our good intentions. And that is
Yeah.
paternalistic and wrong. So in the book, I try to deal with the ideological fallacies that exist in the poverty efforts that we sometimes engage in.
And I believe you have a really practical program that teaches churches how to kind of tweak what they're doing so that it better matches the dignity of the people that they're trying to serve. Why don't you tell us
Yes.
a little bit about those workshops? Is it fair to call it a workshop?
Yes, we have a training. We have
A
two
training.
trainings. One is called Effective Compassion Training, where we teach people what we call the 7 principles of effective compassion of Marvin Olasky, and the principle of subsidiarity, the principle of sphere sovereignty, how to help the poor become, again, the protagonists of their own histories of success, how to place the poor in charge of their own destinies. What happens many times in many of our efforts as Catholics is that we treat the poor as their pets. They put you put the bowl of food there, and the pet comes to eat his food, and you pat the pet on the head, makes you feel good, and you do it again and again and again, because it's easier to distribute things than to actually journey with the poor. When in reality, what we teach through this training is that compassion means to suffer with the poor. In other words, are you willing to suffer with the poor? So it's not fixing every problem. It's not ending poverty. Is to express solidarity with the poor, to become a poor church willing to suffer with the poor, and to find ways to make the poor be at the center of action. And that's where we created also a model project, the Self-Reliance Clubs, where we are teaching the kids, yes, you need those school supplies, but you're not going to stand in line waiting for someone to give them to you. You're going to work, you're going to earn money, and you're going to buy your own school supplies. And now you will really exercise your dignity in that way. And we also have a new training 2 years ago. It's called commonality training, that challenges the diversity, equity, and inclusion, very ideological understanding of race in America that is becoming a problem. We are dividing ourselves into impersonal racial and sexual groups. And the human person again disappears as a token of recognition of these groups. So much so that if I see you as a white person, I don't even need to know your name. I already know everything that needs to be known about you because you are a member of that group. So we don't see each other anymore. So we go to our training in commonality, challenges diversity, equity, and inclusion ideology with a Catholic understanding of the human person.
This is such incredible work that you're doing. I think that you're speaking to my heart because I think it's very John Paul II of you, who of course talks about dignity and that we are
Yes.
subjects. We should never be treated as objects. And the danger
Yes.
of identity views of dividing us in terms of a predetermined identity, if you wish, is that it makes us objects. And yet we are the way we reflect God, having been made in God's image and likeness, is that we are subjects, just like God, that we are individual and we can make decisions and we can be the protagonist of our life. And I
Absolutely.
think that is bringing dignity when we allow and encourage somebody who is poor, whatever happens, to exercise, to exercise that. If somebody would like to be in touch with you about this, tell me, how can people reach you?
Well, they can go to our website. That's the best way to go. fvinstitute.org. fvinstitute.org. That's the best way to learn more about the work of the Freedom and Virtue Institute.
Well, friends, this is one episode I really wish could continue another hour. We would have a lot to talk about. But hopefully this teaser will send you to Ismael's works and books. I very highly recommend. Ismael, thank you so much for the beautiful and important work that you do and for this deep thinking about how to see the poor as real persons. And thanks as always, of course, to you, Rebecca. I love doing this podcast with you. And friends, take care. And till next time, we hope you prosper.